Very much, Sonia. Great. So I'm delighted to be here. Sonia Devane here from Five Innovate Ireland. But prior to that, I spent many years working in the Irish Cancer Society, advocating for greater clinical research, because we all know international evidence shows that patients do better in hospitals that are research intensive. So it's just fantastic to see so many people here today who are coming together to really increase the capacity for clinical research here in Galway and nationwide. At Bioinnovate, I suppose we have exciting healthcare innovations coming out every year from the programme, and most, if not all of those innovations will need to go through some clinical trials at some stage. So having the capacity here in Galway to really test some of those innovations, whether it's first in human or further trials, is really important. So again, fantastic to see so many people getting involved. Before we kick off, I know there's some new people in from lunch, so I might just ask you to raise your hands here or online if you have experience in designing or operating clinical trials. Brilliant. And then how about people who are interested in getting involved maybe in the next year or more in designing or running clinical trials? Great. Okay, so about 50-50 split. Fantastic. That's a lot more audience. So while I kick off, we'll run through a little bit about maybe before you get going on a clinical trial, a bit about some best practice during it, and some reporting afterwards, and finish off and have a look at what's the future hold for clinical trials and some advice for the audience. So I'd like to start off, Declan, with yourself. If we think about best practice in clinical trials, can you tell us, some of the top pieces of advice you have for how we can plan and conduct trials as best as possible?
Thanks, Elaine, and thanks to Sonia, Honor, for the invitation to be in panel. I think it does go back to basics, and certainly many of my mentors over the years would say, go back to your question: what research question do you want your trial to answer? And I don't think we pay enough attention to how we generate and how we identify the question, and how we prioritize it. So I guess if I'm meeting somebody or planning my own trial or reviewing the protocol, first thing I want to see is, where does this question come from? I think two things to bear in mind there that you should be thinking about. You don't have to act like a cranky peer reviewer when you're thinking about your own trial. How would somebody look for this? So I first of all want to look and see what stakeholders were involved in identifying and prioritizing this particular question that you want your trial to answer. Are the stakeholders who were involved representative of the stakeholders who might benefit from the intervention you're testing? And often that's not the case. It's often where people will have a smaller subset of stakeholders involved. That's the first thing. So how are the questions identified and prioritized? And then it's, once you get over that, it's where does your question fit in the global body of evidence? So looking at all of the evidence that's gone before, how does your question compare, and what gap is it trying to fill? And that's best done by doing a systematic review of the previous evidence. Now, what gap are you going to fill? Because downstream, I'll be looking to see when your trial is done. Now go back to your review. How does your trial fit in? And what do your results say? And do we change that previous systematic review that was done? Lots of funders today asking for a systematic review as a rationale to position your question. That's the first thing, I think, in terms of better design trials. Second thing is, we spend, as Alberto will know well, and anybody who's involved in data, lots of speakers earlier on, we spend a lot of time collecting outcome data that will never be used, never see the light of day. And the interesting thing is, despite all of that, we know from patients that we often don't collect outcomes that are important to them. So the second thing, I think, is collect outcomes that you know to be important and relevant for stakeholders. So start looking at core outcome sets. Does a set of outcomes exist for your condition you're interested in curing, fixing, contributing to, whatever it might be? Your device is trying to achieve, whatever it may be. Does a set of outcomes exist that should be the minimum? Whatever you want. But this is a minimum set that people identify as important to all stakeholders. Like that set at least. That allows you then to compare your findings with other trials, for example. A concrete example of that is, some colleagues and I were reviewing some literature about interventions that might help prevent falls in older people. Yeah. But 30% of the trials didn't report fractures, hip fractures, as an outcome. And those of you in the space would know it's a pretty obvious, important outcome to patients, to loved ones, to clinicians. But when you have many trials not collecting them, etc., so you've got a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of waste going on. So I'm sure the outcomes that are being collected are important to all the stakeholders. I think the third thing is probably keep an eye to that you aren't contributing to overall research waste. You aren't wasting your time, that you're not wasting patients' time, you're not wasting clinicians' time, and lots of things feed into that. Is the question important? Is the outcomes important? Does my question answer a gap? Have I tried to map my trial to routine clinical practice as best as possible? Am I making use of routine clinical data where it's possible to do so? Have I spoken with patients and other stakeholders when I'm designing my strategies for recruitment, retention of participants into trials? About 50 to 60% of randomized trials do not achieve the sample size that the researcher said they needed to answer the question that they set out to answer. So there's billions of euro being wasted globally on not enough people joining and staying in trials. Despite that, in 2024, the best high quality evidence we have, we want to retain somebody in a trial, is picking up the phone, calling them sometimes helps. And that's because we're not doing any research into how better recruit participants into trials, how better retain participants in trials.
Yeah, sorry, Sherry. I think so. That's echoing and resonating the waste piece. Because from a best practice perspective, I would say two things. Lean. I'm going to keep saying it. I think there's so much waste, even at an operational level, at a governance level, from a site perspective, from a sponsor perspective, regulator, ethics committees, there's an awful lot of duplication. And there's a lot of processes where there's waiting times, lag times, lack of transparency on where things are at. So I think if you can apply lean principles to the trial design and to the trial operations, it would be phenomenal. The other piece is good project management principles. Anybody that knows me knows that I'll talk about that. But your time, your scope, and your cost, and constantly monitoring those. I think some of the biggest issues with the trials, apart from the kind of operational aspects of recruitment and retention, is delivering the trials in the timeline and the budget. And a lot of that is due to scope creep and not keeping an eye on the original scope. So I think those are the main principles and good project management principles, definitely.
Thanks. I think we get back to that in terms of the reporting and usually all the data that aren't necessarily getting out into the public today. But really important, I think the key message is measure twice, cut once, get your design really optimized and make sure you're answering the key questions in the technical. So we might move on to them during the trial, and so a huge experience, we've recently finished up with one of the important diabetes trials, the EMERGE trial. Tell us, in terms of patient recruitment and retention, so you have the best trial design in the world, which got to get patients on. What strategies do you think are most effective, especially with hard to reach populations?
Okay. So I would say if you're energetic about what you want to do, so if this burning question you want to answer, the important thing is you don't rush into it. So you need to take loads of time to think about it, to talk about it, to talk with other people about it. Because once you get going on the trial, it's only then that you see where your mistakes are, and then you have to backtrack, and that creates an enormous amount of work. So in pushing patients into trials, the first thing is people will not come into the trial unless people with that condition think that trial will benefit them or people like that. So when you think about the trial, designing the trial, you need to talk to lots and lots of patients. So for me, I have a diabetes PPI group, I have a pregnancy PPI group. If I was doing a cardiovascular study, I'd have one of those. So you have to have a disease-specific PPI group, and you must ask them over and over again for the opinion on the question you want to answer, and then for the opinion on how you're going to run the trial. So that's really important. The next thing is when you're designing your stuff to go to ethics, you have to ask yourself again, and you need to take plenty of time. How am I going to recruit these patients? So we all start off and we think, well, I'm just going to run down to the clinic and recruit them. Or I'm just going to send this to the patients a letter and I'll recruit them. They don't really work very well. So you have to think in advance and ask yourself, how do people normally communicate now? So they don't communicate with pieces of paper, they're communicating on their phone. So when you're doing your ethics application, you have to document all the ways in which you're going to communicate with patients. If you only put in 2 and you get an ethics approval, and then 2 months later you're thinking, oh, nobody's coming into my trial, then you have to go back to ethics again. You have to explain to them why you want to recruit A, B, and C ways, and a whole pile of work that's, and nuisance work that really you should be trying to avoid. So that's the second thing. The third thing then is when you're ready to go and get your patients. For me, for example, my first port of call was the clinical area that I worked in. So I thought, oh, I'll just recruit from the clinic. But you really have to understand the process of care delivery in the clinical setting. Because you might say, oh, I'm going to recruit a woman when she's pregnant at week 26. But then you find the clinical process of care delivery does not see people at 26. It's week 20, 24, 28, 32, 36 and term. So if you're trying to entice people into your trial, you have to have your consent process as close as possible to the clinical process in which you're delivering the service. So that doesn't apply for everybody, but it applies for, situations in which you're recruiting patients from the hospital. Now, they're difficult to find patients. It's really important that you put a lot of effort into that. Because when you go to report your findings in a good journal and you want to get it into a good journal, they will ask you to explain why you haven't done that, why your patients are all quite educated, why you have none of these other types of people in it. So we put a lot of effort in our trial to recruit all categories of people. And in fact, we managed to get 20% of our trial population, which was over 100 people, in diverse categories, which were not quite Irish. So that was good. But the 2 groups of people I was really keen on targeting were the traveller population, and you have to work with the Galway traveller movement or a movement like that to get out to talk to these patients in their normal setting, to get them to have confidence in you to come into a trial. And the other group were the international protection people who are here for no reason other than to escape wars and stuff. And you have to try and target them as well, because they, for me, were a population that would really benefit from the trial. So there's ways and means in which you can get out to the population that you want. You won't suddenly decide how I'm going to do it myself, but if you talk to enough people, you get a list of ways in which you can target these people, and then away you go and you have to do that. I think getting people into trials, for me at least, the people into my trial really wanted to talk to the PI. So you might have a research assistant, you might have a nurse who's helping you, but a lot of the time certainly for my work, they wanted to talk to the PI, and you have to make yourself available to talk to them, otherwise they won't come into the trial. So in my clinical practice at the time, any new patient with a new diagnosis, any traveller woman, any non-white woman, any of the difficult categories that I was trying to recruit, I had all those patients directed to my clinic in the clinical setting, and then my colleagues would deal with the return patients. So you really have to provide for the patients the ability for you to talk to them, in the way that they want to get the information from you, and you have to give them plenty of time for it. So the consent process is really, it's not just shove a page in front of people and say, oh, you come into the trial, sign here. For us, we looked at how long does it take to get into a trial. So for us, it was 15 minutes up to 90 minutes. So some ladies I spent an hour and a half talking to, but on average it was 30 minutes. So, you know, if you're a busy clinician, you have to assign yourself a significant amount of time if you want to do a clinical trial properly. It's not a run in and a run out process, it just won't work. And once you get your patients into the trial, then the next really important thing is retention of patients. So if you get 100 in and you lose 50, then the reviewers of your paper will say, well, you've only 50 of the people you recruited, so maybe it's not as good as you think it is because we don't know about the 50 that are gone. So recruitment is important and retention is really important. So you have to really work on strategies for that.
So again, I suppose plenty of time for planning, because not only do you need that time to get in those right patients that you want, but equally it takes time for it. But I'm sure that's a really worthwhile investment to make sure that you get that enrollment and yeah, spot.
Just a quick point, to build on what Fidelma said, I think the eligibility criteria and putting the amount of time that deserves when you're designing your protocol is critical. And if you can dry run your eligibility criteria as much as you can before you lock your protocol in, before you have your regulatory approval and your ethics approval, that's going to be a huge saving when it comes to potentially eliminating patients that should be eligible. So I think that's something to consider when you're at the protocol design stage, is dry running your eligibility criteria as much as you can.
Great tip, Elaine. So for example, with your clinic, you could have done, let's say, a series of eligibility criteria, run it off maybe data that you knew you have in your clinic, but automatically said, how many would I be able to recruit every month based on that? And then you can adjust them if you feel like you're not going to get the numbers.
You really have to devote a huge amount of time to the planning. You know, once you get into running the trial, it's go, go, go. But it's really important to spend a lot of time at planning, asking yourself the question, am I doing it right? Who could I ask? Who this, who that? Because once you start, it's almost too late then, or it creates a huge amount of unnecessary work to backtrack.
Yeah, sorry.
Good point. Andrew's just joined us, so I think many people here would say like it would be unusual for experienced teams to spend a year really fleshing out the detail of a protocol, and it's time spent. That was that don't want to be doing is doing it after you press the green light on recruiting participants. To pick up Fidelma's point, I think it's, you know, we often see and so we know that lots of people who could benefit from interventions aren't included in trials. We say they're underrepresented, but often it's because we forget about them or we ignore them. We don't meet them where trial is possible for them to participate, and we don't offer mechanisms for them to be retained in the trial. We make it difficult and challenging, and then we come along and say they're underrepresented. Actually, we're not representing them often by the mechanisms we implement.
Yeah. So I suppose on the topic of time and the amount of time it takes and the limited time we all have, there are loads of new technologies coming about now. So Elaine, in particular, I want to direct this to you. So what role do you think, you know, the likes of artificial intelligence, machine learning, how is that going to affect how we either plan, conduct or analyze the trials, and how can you see that happening already?
So just to caveat this, I'm definitely not an AI or an ML expert, but I do like efficiencies and I'm a fan of efficiencies. So I think there's huge potential, and I know you can't go to a seminar or a conference or panel discussion anymore without there being an AI topic, but I think the potential in clinical research is just, we're just on the cusp of understanding what that is. I suppose one aspect is the data management and analysis piece. So any data managers, and Alberto, biostatistician, spoke earlier, even with the EDC systems, it's a hugely manual process. Even data cleaning is very manual. You know, we can automate it, we can cobble up there, we can, you know, script programs, but it's still very manual, it's very prone to human error, and it's prone to delays in reviewing the data. So there's huge savings there with AI programs where you can eliminate that lag time, you can have real-time data analysis, and it can really elevate your automated reporting. There's a safety aspect too, because you get more real-time flags of potential negative trends from a safety perspective. So just the efficiencies, the oversight, the safety aspects are huge. It can free up the data manager's time to spend it in a more meaningful way, in pushing into those trial design discussions, for example. It can actually design ECRFs, so AI can be used to design ECRFs based off protocols, which is phenomenal. There's other aspects where it can be used. You talked about retention, Fidelma. So now AI programs can be used from historical data feeding the program and the intelligence. It can predict when patients will drop out of a trial, and it can then give the PI or the research team an indicator that this is a potential dropout point, so they can intervene at that stage with a phone call or whatever the solution. So there's just huge potential. There's risks, definitely, but they can be mitigated. I think the benefits outweigh the risks, but the risks, it's the same with all AI programs, it's the bias. I think that's a big risk, is the bias of the information that's feeding the program and the system. Other risks, like there's huge regulatory concerns. There's a new AI Act in Europe, so the validity of the decisions that the tool is making are really critical. If your AI tools are being used in trials and they're making decisions, they need to be validated, which is a whole other world. But it's not insurmountable, you just need to consider it. And the other aspect with regards to the risk is the GDPR side of it. So I think the transparency to the patient, if you are using AI tools, is really important, and the transparency for accessing patient data. So yeah, I think it's huge potential, but just be mindful of it.
Yeah, rapidly emerging. So Andrew, I want you to introduce yourself to everybody.
Yep.
And give your take on the kind of benefits, risks of those new technologies to move on.
Yeah, so for those who don't know me, I'm Andrew Smith. I'm the professor of clinical epidemiology here in the university, and I used to be the director of the research facility. I'm involved in lots of different trials over the years. With respect to AI, I'd agree with everything Elaine has said, and I'm usually the one that is most negative about using technology and risk and all of that. But Elaine has covered that, so I don't need to do it this time. I think there's a couple of clinical areas that AI has huge potential, and one is looking through medical records, particularly ones that are actually typed. Handwritten ones, not so much, because the potential for error is there. But if you're looking at eligibility criteria where you want to go through large volumes of medical records to find something or not find something, similarly, if you're going to look at imaging, you're going to look at reports. If your outcome for your trial, so separate to the intervention, what you're looking at is, do you have an improvement in flow in something? Do you have an improvement in the structure of something? Is there an imaging change? Is there a clinical change? All of those things, a lot of the algorithms that are built into most imaging software fall into that category. So I think there's a lot of scope, because anyone who's worked in clinical trials will know that you see a huge amount of clinical data. You see a lot of records. It's very hard to process them. And even we think of source documents that get submitted to data management and to safety review, they're often non-scannable, like they're images, they're pictures, rather than classical PDFs that you'd search like you would in a report. And I think as AI and the models for that, even recognizing that sort of stuff moves on, there's huge scope for efficiency. And that includes things like event adjudication or event verification. So if you have a clinical outcome that's important, so if we're doing a med tech trial that's looking at something cardiac, whether you've got heart failure or whether you've had a heart attack or whether you've got something else, most trials would have a definition as to what that is. And you're searching through the source documents to see, did the blood test show this, did this imaging finding show that? And I'd say as someone who's adjudicated a lot of events, it can take forever to go through it, and the potential for human error goes up.
Yeah.
So I think there's huge scope for it to improve the efficiency of some of those processes. I don't think it will do it standalone. I think it still needs to be an eyeball check for certain things, and that addresses some of the risks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're seeing that in all kind of sectors. You know, we had a talk recently this week with Walsh from MIT. He was talking about how previously market research in an area would take these 2 weeks, and now they can do that in 15 minutes. So we can get straight in after 15 minutes, actually start segmenting, looking at market, you know, so that's what they're writing in tools. So I suppose, yeah, not to alienate anybody in the audience now, but I did read a study before I came in to say that or a review from a pharmacy conference to say that in 2050, if you're working in clinical trials, you'll most likely be a data scientist. So I think the data scientists in the audience would be delighted, and everyone else would be upskilling on what that means and what are the roads around that. But I suppose to move on to, I suppose, the mentorship and maybe career development for people in the audience here. So I'll start off with you, with a wealth of experience in the panel here. In the New Clinical Trials Institute, for people who want to get involved or who have some involvement and want to really increase their activity in clinical trials, how do you see the best way for them to, I suppose, get access to that wealth of information and get the mentorship they need to ask the right question and to be really efficient in their trial design, to recruit diversity and to keep those people on the trials?
Thank you. So lots of questions there. But I think the best way to be successful in a clinical trial is to be part of a team. So Fidelma on her own can't conduct a clinical trial. So maybe I thought that 20 years ago, but I'm very educated on that. And I know that that's not possible. So if you're interested in clinical trials, you've got to get involved in a team. So if you're a psychiatrist, get involved with that team. If you're diabetes, get involved with my team. If you're GI, there's another team for that. There's teams for everything. So if you're interested in clinical trials, get involved with the team and talk to those team members. If you're a clinician, the best way to get involved in a trial is to express your interest in a particular disease area, then to sign up as a co-PI for a trial after you've done the relevant training. So forth. Then you have somebody around you all the time helping you. You get to know the documentation, you get to know the reporting, you get to know how to consent people with a team of people around you helping you. And it's really important to do that first before you go any further. You have to get comfortable with that space before going any further. If you're a scientist and you're not going to be, say, the clinician consenting and treating patients, but you're still involved in the area of clinical trials, there's a wealth of experience and skill sets now in the university and in the Institute of Clinical Trials. So you can go all the way from doing a systematic review, doing a core outcome set, doing a set of patient-reported outcomes, getting involved in PPI, or looking at how you might disseminate trial information from a team of people who've been doing the trial. Because unless you get your trial findings out to policy and guidelines, you're not going to change clinical practice. So what's the point in doing a trial if you're never going to do, if it's not going to impact clinical practice? So I think being a scientist, a data scientist, somebody who's in AI, somebody who's in devices, somebody who's a clinician, and there is room for everybody. And you know, it's very hard to me to go around and say, are you interested? Are you interested? So you have to show your face. If you're interested, you have to say it to somebody, and then of course people can be plugged in.
Yep. That's brilliant. I suppose it's similar in lots of different fields. You know, you need to shadow, as you said, get comfortable, work with people who know what they're doing, and then you can do it yourself next time around. Just on the skills piece, did anyone else want to Declan? Do you want to add in on the skills? And I know Sonia, you're going to talk about some of the particular programs as well afterwards.
Sonia talk about the particular programs, and not that we have a lot of so the Institute and the organisations within it, the Health Research Board Trials Methodology Research Network. We run monthly webinars. There's hundreds of hours of recordings from world leaders in particular areas, be that on some pharmaceutical analysis, be that on adverse event reporting and the complexities there, whatever it might be. So there's lots of information available. Those of you a bit more experienced, for example, the HRB Trial Methodology Research Network, again, the Institute offers placement programs for people who want to be placed on trial steering committees, data monitoring boards, risk committees, etc. So you actually go into those groups, shadow really experienced people, you're there as an observer to hear conversations going on, the complexities, the nuances, and to learn through that mentorship approach.
I just jump in just very briefly.
Yes.
From a clinical research kind of support professional perspective, I think there's not enough probably undergraduate, there's really good postgraduates, and Sonny will probably talk about that, but undergraduate training. So I don't think anybody I know working in this field or the likes of my role went to university to train in this. But it doesn't mean that your skills aren't transferable. So I think there's huge scope for a very rewarding career in clinical research as a research support professional. So I would say talk to people, vigilance officers, data managers, programmers, and just understand what their role is and maybe what their background was. And you might be really surprised. I think it's a very rewarding role, and you're not necessarily the PI or interfacing directly with the patient, but some people prefer that. So I think it's something definitely to consider for those that are looking for a kind of a career path.
As I said earlier, if it wasn't recorded, it didn't exist, so you will be there.
And I just come back on your point there that training is really important in this phase. It doesn't mean you get a PhD in X, but you have to have practical training. So, you know, you wouldn't send a doctor on the ward without training. You wouldn't send a nurse out without training. You wouldn't send a phlebotomist out without training. So really, you should be sending a trials person into any arena of clinical trials without the appropriate training. So, you know, there are mavericks around who think they can do everything, but the mavericks bring down the institution. So people who are involved in the space need to be properly trained in the space.
Thanks, Fidelma. So I suppose we have 10 minutes until we're going to finish up here. I'm going to start looking towards the future now. What does the future of clinical trials look like? So I suppose we touched a little bit on the kind of emerging technologies for analysing. Elaine, do you see any other trends coming out that we need to kind of be watchful for in the clinical trial space?
I think there's multiple emerging trends. The decentralized trials, I think, is something that's going to definitely expand. FDA recently released a guidance document around that, and like COVID kind of forced it. But some aspects of it is a no-brainer. And from a patient retention perspective, if you can alleviate the burden on the patient for having to come to the main hospital site and do some remote visits and tele visits, you know, video calls and things, that's huge. I think that's going to expand. I think AI is going to help with that as well, like we talked about earlier. I think the e-systems are only going to keep getting smarter, more intelligent, e-consent, just, you know, and even the e-pro, the patient reported outcomes is huge, like they're only kind of starting. So I think from a kind of systems perspective, that's what I would see. I think just to plug the institute, I think that the network, but the network piece of it is so important. And I think, and Fidelma will talk about this probably in a minute, but like the Trialist Institute is breaking down huge barriers nationally. And I think they're at the forefront of where the trial kind of network can grow. And that could bring huge efficiencies as well. Fidelma wants to come in. Definitely wants to come in.
Okay, so two things. The institute is there to make sure that more trials come to the region or come to Ireland. The question we all have to ask is, why is that not happening currently? The reason it's not happening is there are roadblocks to the process of when you get an idea of doing a trial to when you deliver the trial. Those process blockages occur in many areas, including HPRA, NREC, GPIA contracts. They're just a few. Once you get all that sorted, then you have a number of blockages in getting your patients into the trial. So we're working locally here to try and overcome that. And we're doing that in two ways. Firstly, we've developed a hypercare model. So we're using this hypercare model to go through the system and find out where in fact are these blockages and pushing in solutions as we go along. So we're doing it on a trial basis with 2 or 3 companies first. When we know where these blockages are and we have the solutions, I think this institute should then provide the hypercare service to any company who wants it. And the second thing we're doing is an advisory service or an advisory, it's a almost to allow it to get going. But Emily here in the audience has worked out the process of an advisory service. So you might want to do a trial, you haven't a clue, you don't know where to begin. Right, where would I get information? I don't want all the highfalutin stuff, I just want the basics so that I can go away and think about it, look at the documents, and then maybe I decide, no, I'm not doing that, or I am doing that, and then we move on. So we're going to be providing both of those here locally, in addition to everything that hangs in the Institute pillars of activity. But more importantly, nationally, the Minister for Health has convened a national clinical trials oversight group, because the Minister now realises that we have to correct this problem, and he's convened a group of people from around the country. I'm there from our institute, and the reason he wants to do this is he knows that clinical trials have an impact on health outcomes in the country. But more importantly, he knows that it has an economic advantage to the country if we can bring in clinical trials. So the group is running just for 12 months. We meet monthly, and he's having interim reports and has promised that he's going to fund the solutions we come up with for the problems. So I think there's great momentum in the country to get more clinical trials in, and they're INP, but also clinical trials in devices, because we have the whole device service all around us here in Galway, and we're not using it. Sorry.
I'll get into you, Declan, if that's okay, because I'm just where I want to keep the time and get focused on the outcomes at the end for yourself and Andrew. But so we touched Elaine, emerging trends, decentralisation of some of the trials. Surely that would result in some cost efficiencies as well, making it cheaper to run the trials. And Fidelma, I know you've talked before about the importance of funding.
Yeah.
Running clinical trials is expensive. So it's really important to bring in collaborators, bring in industry collaborators and academics. So how can we do more of that? And I'll bring in Devane and Andrew in the last question.
So certainly running an INP regulated trial is about, I would say, and Andrew can Declan can correct me, at least 2.5 million. So if you go to HRB, you might get 1 million. So where are you going to put with the other 1.5 million? You have to look at your institution, you have to look at your industry partners, and you have to kind of get out and work with your industry partners so that they become true partners on your application when you're designing and setting a trial. So, you know, people sit on their budget tots and expect everybody else is going to come running to them. That doesn't happen. You know, if you want to engage with industry, you have to go and engage with industry. So you say, how could I engage with industry? I'd say, well, you need to see Mary, Joe, Pat, Patricia, and Frank. And when you've all those done, do a little summary for me and come back, and then I'll tell you where we can go next. So industry are out there, they want to engage, they have money. It's in everybody's interest to combine the monies and do one good piece of work instead of me doing 50 patients, somebody else doing another 50, and then actually we didn't do them all the same, so we can't combine the data. So it's really important that you get out and talk to your industry partners. For me here, one of the important aspects of the work in Pillar 1 is developing partnerships. So certainly I'm out talking to industry and I'm making connections with people, but individuals have to do that as well.
That's right. And I suppose collaborating more with industry probably has other benefits as well on the outcome side of things, which we're going to touch on now in the very last point. If you're working with industry, there may be a greater chance or greater resources to make promoting the results of that trial to actually so that the results get to patients. Would you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you're in an academic institution and you do a piece of work and you have an industry partner, that's great. But you can't be seen to be promoting an industry product or an industry INV. But the industry may be able to help you to disseminate the information in a non-industry way. So that's a really important take-home message. You can't be shown to be putting your eggs into one basket.
No, good point. So I suppose looking at the future, and I suppose recapping on where we are in terms of the outcomes. Declan, you mentioned at the very start that we're collecting loads of data that never makes it into the public domain. I was looking for the time of year at like the rates at which clinical trial data is actually reported. and they can be shockingly low. They've come up, but even now, there's probably in and around 50% or so of trials that are reporting their data within the 12 months of finishing the trial, and those are probably better in some countries and worse in others. But we've seen so many different things happen now in the last while in terms of new technologies, emerging trends. Surely it's going to be a push on actually getting, exciting, promising data from clinical trials to the point where it's making a difference to patients. So how can we play a part in that? So I'm going to ask you, Declan, how do we play a part in that, and Andrew? Thanks.
That's probably one of the most important questions, isn't it? Because the literature is riddled with trials that haven't made it to practice, or there's a few number of issues. Number one is we're not publishing all the trials, as you said, and those that are inconclusive or findings that might not show effectiveness of the intervention are not being published. Number one. Number two, trials that are being published are often behind paywalls. Sometimes with accessibility, that's an issue. There's two things. So I think we're looking at publishing all trial findings within the time frames and publishing them in open access sources. But perhaps the biggest translation gap we have is translating that evidence that exists into policy and into practice. And that's where we have, frankly, as a community, put very little effort into over the years. And it's something we need to be working much harder at. The Institute does have a pillar dedicated to evidence to policy and evidence to practice. And I think that's one of the most challenging areas. It's one of the most difficult. It's one of the ones where there aren't off-the-shelf solutions. There isn't consensus on best methodological approaches. Often when answering a clinical question, there is consensus in many aspects of how we should plan, do, and share the findings of trials. Not all, but in some areas, certainly. Very little evidence of how we take the next step. How do we move that evidence into policy, into practice? So I think it's beholden on us all to start looking at investigating what are the optimal strategies we can use to move trial findings into practice and into policy. That might be, how do we infiltrate clinical practice guideline groups, for example? How do we get our trial evidence informing recommendations? The other gap then, of course, is just because it's in a clinical practice guideline or a policy doesn't mean it's going to hit the bedside, doesn't mean it's going to impact on the policy. How do you start looking at that? And just to flip things around slightly, I think we need to and I do see it moving this way. So lots of research assessment mechanisms today are less concerned, they are concerned about the paper that's published, but are more concerned about the impact that paper has. And having a very high impact paper being published doesn't hold as much weight today as having a lower impact one, which can demonstrate the impact of it and its movement into practice, either policy or clinical practice. We can demonstrate that today is more valued in most research assessment exercises. We just need the academic sector to recognise that more in promotions of it.
And there's probably, new channels of communicating results as well. I know that scientific and the clinical community are often have been very active on the Twitter, X, and podcasts can be used also as a platform for recruitment in certain countries. But it's certainly an area where people, when a really exciting brand comes out, can start generating conversation. And that's probably opening it up to people who are maybe otherwise not people who would log on and read, a picture here on the morning. So official to you, Andrew, how do you feel we can really get the impact of what we're doing to patients more effectively?
Yeah, so I agree with what's been said before. I think there's a huge focus in the medical and the scientific community on getting a paper. The industry side of it is focused on getting an indication and a license and getting a place in the market. They're all fine, but they don't necessarily impact what's going on with the patient. I think the healthcare world has changed drastically. 30, 40 years ago, the doctors told the patients what to do and nobody ever questioned it. It's completely different now. I think patient advocacy is probably going to be as, if not more powerful than medical people talking to a hospital manager. There's a big role for public and patient involvement in the dissemination of research findings, and people actually understanding the research findings. Everything's written very medical, so if you don't know that this drug actually might apply to you or this device might apply to you, people don't ask their doctors about it. They don't ask their physicians about it. So the drug or device or behavioral intervention might have the evidence, might have the indication. Sometimes, you do see patients where I may not know of a trial. a patient comes in and goes, I've just read this, or they advocate that way. I think it's important that we try and address the regulatory and scientific pieces, but we can't lose the voice of the patient. And I think when you see, particularly in Ireland, considering how small town politics works for absolutely everything, we do want to have people advocating, pushing for treatments and things. So, you know, there's loads of examples, but I think that's probably our best way.
Sorry, I'll just say, I'll give you the last word for that. Just to say thank you so much to the panel. I think we've got some really great pieces of advice for people who are either, you know, have a bit of experience or are new to clinical research. Thank you very much for joining us, Andrew, as well. I'm going to now the last word before handing over to Sonia.
No, I'm not having the last. Okay, thank you, everybody.
I'm not running.
We'll hand over to Sonia.